Hello, I am Gloria Robert. Today we are looking at the topic pollination in flowers. Objectives of lesson. As the lesson progresses, the learners should be able to 1. Define pollination. 2. Mention examples of agents of pollination. 3. Mention the two types of pollination. 4. State the features of self-pollination. 5. Mention the features of cross-pollination. And 6. State at least 3 differences between self-pollination and cross-pollination. What is pollination? This is the transfer of matured pollen grains from the anther of one flower to the matured or receptive stigma of the same flower or another flower found on another plant. Now, pollination usually takes place before fertilization. Meaning is that pollination and fertilization are not the same at all. Pollination occurs before fertilization. Now, studying the image we have here, we have two flowers. Now, at point 1, which is the anther, and inside the anther we have the pollen grains. Now, the movement of the pollen grains, or the transfer of the pollen grains from the point 1 to point 3, which is the stigma, is called pollination. So, in a simple term, we can say pollination is the movement or transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of a flower. So, let's talk about the types of pollination. There are two types of pollination, namely 1. Self-pollination, 2. Cross-pollination. And so we are going to start by looking at self-pollination. Now, what is self-pollination? This is the transfer of matured pollen grains from the anther of a flower to the stigma of the same flower or to the stigma of another flower on the same plant. And so self-pollination can occur in tomato and pears and so on. Now, self-pollination involves only one parent plant. So only one plant is involved. The plant can have many flowers, it doesn't matter, but just one plant. Good. Now, if you look at the image here, we have a plant, and on the plant we have two different flowers. Now, self-pollination can occur in different ways. The first one is when the anther of a flower moves to the stigma of the same flower. That is self-pollination. Or when the pollen grains in the anther of a flower moves to the stigma of another flower on that same plant, that is also self-pollination. So take time and go through this. Now look at the features of self-pollinated flowers. There are some flowers that can only be pollinated by self-pollination method. And so let's look at some features that favor such process. Number 1, we have homogamy. Now, this is the ripening of the anther and the stigma of a bisexual flower at the same time. Remember, in flower, we said that bisexual flowers are those flowers that have both the male and the female reproductive system on them. And so the meaning is that they have the anther, which represents the male, and they have the stigma, which represents the female. And so when the anther, or the pollen grains of the anther and the stigma ripen or matures at the same time, self-pollination can take place. Number 2 is Cleistogamy. This occurs in bisexual flowers that do not open. So these flowers don't open, and so the male part and the female part, don't forget they are bisexual, remain inside. And so it is possible that the ripened pollen grains are deposited on the stigma of that flower at the same time. And so this is self-pollination process. So let's look at advantages of self-pollination. Number 1 is that it ensures that pollination takes place. Now, the meaning is that there is high successful rate of pollination. That means it is compulsory, it is sure, it is certain that pollination will take place in this kind of self-pollination. Number 2 is that offspring do not genetically vary from parents. So if the end point is to have a clone of an organism, then self-pollination is the best way to go. Number 3 is that it prevents wastage of pollen grains. Since it involves certain what we call agents of pollination, these agents are definitely going to move pollen grains to the stigma. And not only that, most of the pollen grains are not many, and so they are likely to fall on the stigma. So it's not a wasteful process at all. Disadvantages of self-pollination. Number 1 is that the offsprings are weak. Yes, because there is no genetic difference or variance. And number 2 is that the new offsprings is less able to adapt to its environment. So it's not able to resist diseases because it's not genetically different. It's weak. It's just not there. All right. So these are some of the disadvantages of self-pollination. So let's look at number 2, cross-pollination. This is the transfer of mature pollen grains from the anther of a flower to the stigma of a flower on another plant of the same species or that are closely related. And this can occur in we have hibiscus and purple here. Okay, cross-pollination involves two parent plants. Don't forget, self-pollination involves only one parent. Cross-pollination depends on external agents like wind and insect and so on to take place. Now, when we say cross-pollination, we have two different flowers on two different plants. However, the plants must be of the same species or closely related species. So if the pollen grains from the anther of one flower on a plant is moved to the stigma of another flower on another plant, that is cross-pollination. They were crossed. Good. All right, so let's move on. So let's look at some features that of cross-pollinated flowers. Number one, we have unisexuality. Don't forget, we talked about bisexual flowers. So this occurs in unisexual flower, whereby they have only one of the reproductive system, maybe the male only or the female only. So this is when a flower has only the male or only the female reproductive part, and this can exist in dioecious plants. What do we mean by dioecious plants? These are flowers or plants with the male and the female flower, which occurs on separate plants. So we have a plant with just the male part, and we have another plant with just the female plant. Such plants is dioecious plant, and such a flower is dioecious flower, and so purple is a good example. Number two features of cross-pollinated flower is dichogamy. Now, when male and the female part matured at different times, that is dichogamy. Now, dichogamies can be protandry. Protandry means when the anther or the male part ripens before the female part, which is the stigma, and that can occur in sunflower, okra, and cotton. Then protogeny, that is when the stigma, which is the female part now, matures before the male part, known as a anther, and so this can take place in palms, figs, and the rest. Number three features that can support cross-pollinated flowers, we have sterility, also known as self-incompatibility. Now, this is a condition in which some flowers are not compatible together, so they don't match, they are sterile. So the flower just makes itself sterile to its own pollen grains. So a pollen grain from such flower that falls on its stigma can be injurious or harmful to the flower. So they are just not compatible, they don't flow together. All right, so let's move on. So we are going to be looking at advantages and disadvantages of cross-pollination. One advantage of cross-pollination is that offspring genetically varies from parents. Yes, we have two different plants, so we are going to have the gene of first plant and second plant mixing together. Definitely the offspring is going to be different from both of them, unlike in self-pollination. Number two, the offsprings are healthier and they are better able to resist diseases. Number three is that the new offsprings is more able to adapt to its environment. What about disadvantages of cross-pollination? One is that it requires pollinators to take place. So without pollinators, it cannot occur. Then number three, that is a wasteful process. Why? Because the pollen grains that are produced are so numerous, and most of them are carried by the wings and then drop onto the ground or surfaces where they are not going to germinate or lead to pollination. So for that reason, it leads to waste stage of pollen grains. So let's move on. Let's look at the difference between self-pollination and cross-pollination. Self-pollination, now don't forget, it's involves the transfer of pollen grain from the anther of the flower to the stigma of the same flower or the stigma of another flower on the same plant. We've discussed that before. While cross-pollination simply means the transfer of pollen grains from the anther of a flower to the stigma of a flower on another plant. Now, number two is that self-pollination involves only one parent. Cross-pollination involves two parents plant. Number three, pollen grains are not wasted at all. We discussed that under advantages and disadvantages. Then in cross-pollination, pollen grains are wasted. Yeah, most of them are produced and then just did not get pollinated. Number four, external pollinating agents may not be required. External pollinating agents may not be required. Why? Under cross-pollination, external pollinating agents is a requirement, so they are very, very highly required. Then number five is that in self-pollination, it occurs in bisexual flowers with both the male and the female part, so it makes it easy for such a flower to pollinate itself. While under cross-pollination, it occurs in both unisexual and bisexual flowers. So take your time and go through these differences. You can even get more from the study of cross and self-pollination. So let's look at agent of pollination. What are agents of pollination? These are external factors that help to bring about pollination. The meaning is that they help to bring about the transfer of pollen grains from a flower to the stigma. They are also called pollinators, right? Now, examples of pollinators, we can have insects such as butterfly, bees, wasps, moths, termites, ants, and so on. Note that not all insects are pollinators. Remember, butterfly is a common pollinator. Number 2 agent of pollination, we have the wind. Wind can also help to move pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of a flower. Number 3, we have water. Water can as well help in transferring pollen grains to the stigma of a flower. And number 4, we have other animals such as man, birds, snails, bats, and so on. So here are different images showing different pollinators. So just go through them, note them, and know them. Thank you. Alright, let's get characteristics of insect pollinated flowers. There are some flowers that can be pollinated by insects. These flowers are called entomophilous flowers. Now, what are their characteristics? Number 1 is that they have large conspicuous petals and sepals. Their petals, that is the bright part of the flower, which can be color red, yellow, purple, and the rest. They are usually very large and very, very obviously seen, okay, so that it can attract insects to them. Number 2 is that they are brightly colored. Yes, such flowers are very beautiful. They are brightly colored, of course, to attract the insects to themselves or other animals, other pollinators. Number 3, possession of scent. They scent very nicely. Number 4, presence of nectar, responsible for the scent. Number 5, they have flat, sticky stigma, which help them to receive the pollen grains easily. Number 6, they have presence of rough, sticking, and relatively few pollen grains. Examples of such flowers, we can have hibiscus, crostalaria, pride of Barbados, rose flowers, and so on. So take note. Common one, brightly colored, they have scent, they have nectar, they are large and conspicuous. They have large and conspicuous petals. Common one in case of your examination. Okay, let's get characteristics of wind pollinated flowers. Wind pollinated flowers are also known as anemophilous flowers. These are flowers that can only be pollinated by wind. Okay, now what are their characteristics? The petals and the sepals are small and inconspicuous. That means they are not easily seen. They are very small. Now they have dark color. They have dark color, so the flowers are dark colored. Then scent is absent in them. Why would they have scent? There is no need for insect to come to them. Winds don't care about scent. Okay, nectar is absent inside such flowers. They have large quantity of pollen grains being produced, and that is why it's a wasteful process. Number 6, pollen grains are small, light, and sticky to easily allow them to stick to the stigma. Then number 7, stigma is elongated, sticky with large surface area. They're broad. Okay, examples of flowers that can carry out that can be pollinated by wind, we have grasses and cereals like maize, guinea corn, rice, wheat, millet, and so on. Okay, so go through, you should get it. And at this point, I'll tell you that you should be able to know the differences between flowers that are being pollinated by insects and those pollinated by winds. Just look at it and compare. In insect pollinated flowers, they have scent, yes, their petals are brightly colored, they have nectars, their petals are large and conspicuous. While in the other one, which is the wind pollinated flowers, their petals are inconspicuous and very small. They don't have scent, their petals are not brightly colored, they don't have nectar. These are the differences between these two. So just take your time and take note. You should be able to know at least 6 of them, okay, in case of exam time. So at this moment, I want to say we've got into our student activity. So it's time for you to actually test your mastery of this topic. Like I will always say, if you don't understand or you're not able to answer any, don't bother yourself. Go back to the video, watch it, download it, view it as many times as possible, and I believe at the end you'll be able to tackle all the questions here and even more. All right, so please subscribe to my video if you have not. Yes, watch the video if you need to, so that you can learn more. Comment, drop your comments. I would like to actually hear from you. Like my video and click the notification bell. All is for our own good. Your good, my good. Thank you. So at this moment, this is the answers to our student activities. It's time for you to mark yourself. Come. Yes, 10 questions, 10 good answers. So I believe you have 100%. So at this moment, I'll say thank you for joining in this session. Thanks for learning today. Have a wonderful time.